The origins of the English language and its literature may be found in the title of this series, English Literature, a Survey. The word English comes from the name of the Germanic tribe that settled in the North Sea island in the late 5th century A.D., the Angles. Literature derives from a Latin noun, meaning letters. And finally, the word survey comes from medieval French, to see, to look over. Latin, German, and French are the three languages which have given form and shape to the English tongue. Their cultures and folk tales and mindsets are the wellsprings of English literature. The earliest recorded inhabitants of England were the Celts. When Julius Caesar brought his armies to England in 54 BC, he found tribes called the Britanniae, or Britons. And so the Romans called this cold, misty island at the northwestern limit of their empire, Britannia. Caesar led a preliminary expedition. The Romans had heard of the island's minerals and were to exploit them, particularly in the mining of tin. A century later, some 40 years after the birth of Christ, armies under the Emperor Claudius secured the conquest of Britain. The Celtic natives of Britannia spoke a language which is the ancestor of modern Gaelic and Welsh. They also had a literature, both folk tales and legends, repeated orally, and inscriptions called runes, which were made by the Druid priests. The priests guarded the secret meaning of these runes, and thus was established in Britain from the very beginning a tradition of the sacredness of writing. Celtic language and culture were submerged during the 400 years that the Romans remained in their land. The Roman legions subjugated and settled most of the island. Only the northernmost region remained untamed. Hadrian's Wall, which stretches across the island, was erected to keep out the Picts, ancestors of the modern Scottish. Roman civilization partially assimilated the Britons, as numerous monuments of Roman culture show. The elaborate villas, with their astonishingly beautiful mosaic floors, which archaeologists have unearthed. The relics of baths and forts and walls and theaters. The famous Roman roads, whose straight outlines still crisscross the country. But the Romanization of Britain was never complete. The Romans were forced to withdraw in the early 5th century as their empire crumbled under the assault of Germanic invaders. Britain was abandoned and was to be the prize of a new wave of settlers called the Anglo-Saxons. Actually, Anglo-Saxon is a collective term referring to three peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They were closely related to the Germanic warriors who shattered the Roman Empire in Western Europe. They came to Britain from the European shores of the North Sea, from the mainland of modern Denmark, which was called Jutland, through Holland. The Anglo-Saxon tribes conquered various parts of England in the later 5th and 6th centuries. Gone was the central organization of Roman Britain, and in its place, dozens of small, independent kingdoms were established. Gone was writing and learning, for the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had no alphabet, only runes, which were commonly engraved in special inscriptions. This engraving they called reten, which would become the modern word write. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes spoke slightly different West Germanic dialects. They settled in approximately equal thirds in the greater part of England, the Saxons to the south and west, the Jutes in the southeast, and the Angles in the Midlands and to the north. Although they had subdued the Celts in warfare, the three tribes lived in comparative disunity. Their languages, although very similar, had yet to merge into one commonly accepted tongue. But these are the languages which, more than any other, formed the core of English. Two changes which occurred soon after the Anglo-Saxon invasions were highly significant. Christian missionaries had been in England during the Roman period. Now, several centuries later, new groups of missionaries were sent by the Pope in Rome and were highly successful in converting the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. These missionaries also brought with them the Roman alphabet and the very tools of writing itself, pen, ink, and paper. The Anglo-Saxon runes, which had to be painstakingly engraved, were gradually supplanted by Roman letters, which were written more swiftly and conveniently, although several runes were adapted into the Anglo-Saxon alphabet for sounds which were common in English but missing in the Latin tongue. Thus the Anglo-Saxons, who had displaced the Romans in Britain, were rapidly associated with the legacy of Roman culture in two important ways: Christianity in religion, and the foundation for writing and literature. As for the native Celts, they withdrew to the island's more inhospitable regions, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall. It is interesting that the very word Celt comes from a root word meaning to hide. Modern Welsh, or Cymry, and Gaelic in Ireland are individual survivals of their language. But their religion, like that of the Anglo-Saxons, became a historical relic. One of its few remaining symbols is the mysterious monument of Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in southern England. In the case of the Anglo-Saxons, a vivid reminder of their pre-Christian religion is in our names for the days of the week, almost all of which refer to pagan divinities. For example, Wednesday is the day of Woden, king of the gods, and Thursday is named for Thorin, or Thor, god of thunder. Around 600 A.D., King Ethelbert of Kent, a new convert to Christianity, published a law code, which is the first surviving document in a dialect of the Old English language. Christianity and the art of writing converged in the ecclesiastical history of the Venerable Bede, a monk at Jarrow in northern England in the early 8th century. Bede wrote in Latin, and his aim was to produce a history of the English peoples from the Roman conquest down to his own day. In Bede's history is preserved one of the oldest poems of Old English, the Hymn of Cadman, an Angle or Englishman of the late 7th century. About 150 years after Bede's history was completed, King Alfred of the West Saxons achieved a certain measure of unity among the peoples of England in the late 9th century. All of them were threatened by a new wave of invaders, this time the Danes from Scandinavia. In a remarkable feat of compromise, largely due to Alfred's political skill, the Danes and Norsemen, sometimes called the Vikings, were peaceably absorbed and allowed to settle and mingle with the Anglo-Saxons, chiefly in the eastern part of England. The Danes brought with them yet another language, which was important in the formation of English, a North Germanic dialect which we call Old Norse, related to, but not identical with, the West Germanic tongues of the Anglo-Saxons. Besides displaying political genius, King Alfred was a great patron of culture. He encouraged the art of writing in his kingdom, and ordered that Bede's history be translated from Latin to Anglo-Saxon, or more properly speaking, Old English, the term which we conventionally use to designate any of the slightly different forms of the language in the different regions of England between about 650 and 1100. King Alfred is also believed to have been the chief force behind the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a written record kept in Old English of the chief events in England, kept year by year until the 12th century. It is because of the impetus which Alfred gave to writing that many of the important documents of early English history and literature have survived. Even before King Alfred had encouraged the wider dissemination of writing in England itself, the influence of English learning had been felt on the continent. The scholarly theologian Alcuin, who came from the northern city of York, had aided the Emperor Charlemagne in the early medieval revival of learning, which we call the Carolingian Renaissance. In many ways, the Christian monasteries of England, although built for the worship of a different god from those at Stonehenge, incorporated the original Celtic notion of writing as a sacred trust. The love of learning and of books is a basic fact of English culture, even as that culture has changed over the centuries. The last principal factor in the basic formation of English has a traditionally exact historical date. In 1066, under King William the Conqueror, the Normans invaded England. At the Battle of Hastings, they defeated the Anglo-Saxons of King Harold. History had run full circle, at least in some respects. We can now see that the language which William brought with him, the highly Latinized medieval French, was in fact a descendant of the classical Latin of Roman Britain. William himself was a descendant of Norse pirates, who had been given the province of Normandy in northwest France in which to settle several centuries before. These Norsemen merged with the Franks, just as the Danes had merged with the Anglo-Saxons under King Alfred. We call the language that developed under the Normans Middle English, the stage of our tongue which combines Latin and French words with a base of Old English, and which lasts between about 1100 and 1500. Middle English is far closer to modern English after 1500 than it is to the Germanic Anglo-Saxon dialect of King Alfred. The typical reader of the great epic of Old English literature, the anonymously composed Beowulf, needs a modern translation. But the reader of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English toward the end of the 14th century, can easily make out most of the words, although their pronunciation in Chaucer's day differed substantially from modern standard practice. For a while under the Normans, from the 12th to the 14th centuries, England was actually a land of three languages: French, or Anglo-Norman, at the court, Latin in the church, and the dialects of Middle English among the people. Even Middle English, like its predecessor Old English, was fractionalized into different dialects according to region. Chaucer, for example, wrote in the London dialect, quite different from the northwestern forms used in the romance called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, an anonymous masterpiece which is also dated in the 14th century. It was not until the end of that century that the divided state of affairs began to be resolved, and we shall never really know why the stubborn persistence of English won out over Latin and French. One intriguing theory connects the triumph of English with the early establishment of English nationalism. As invaders of England around 500 AD, the Anglo-Saxons accepted Christianity, but they refused to give up their Germanic tongue in favor of native Celtic or the Latin of the Romans. When they were conquered in their turn by the Normans, Anglo-Saxon speech among the people never became extinct. Although the English were treated as social and cultural inferiors, they preserved a sense of their past glory. And since 1066 is the date of the last successful invasion of England, right up to our own time, these island natives possessed, perhaps uniquely in Western Europe, a highly conscious awareness of themselves as a nation. Once figures such as King Alfred had unified their separate tribes. This consciousness did not preclude the preservation in English language and culture of diverse features. The Celtic legacy to England was soon evident, for it was a mixture of mythical Celtic elements and Anglo-Norman literary versions which gave England the preeminent legends of her nationhood, the stories surrounding King Arthur and his knights. The Romans too left a mark on England that endured long after their withdrawal. The order of their straight roads is perhaps the physical counterpart to a deeply ingrained sense of order in society, an order achieved by a system of laws. English language and culture, then, have undergone a fascinating series of changes in 20 centuries. Every successive stage has witnessed combinations of old and new, of native and foreign. The development of English literature has also been a series of recombinations, assimilations, and experiments. Beowulf, the first indisputable masterpiece of our literature, presents right at the beginning the motif of diversity. The poem includes both pagan and Christian elements. Its story grew out of oral tradition and was fixed in written form centuries later, around 800. The poet who composed this fantastic tale of kings, heroes, and monsters perceived no distinction between poetry and history. Perhaps most obviously, Beowulf sets the stage for one of the most consistent themes throughout English literature: the fragile balance between order and chaos. But the narrative of Beowulf is a memorial to the Anglo-Saxon past before the invasions, and never once mentions England. In this sense, English literature begins on foreign shores. Perhaps one reason that its subsequent history contains great works of every genre in every period is linked with the genius of the English for balancing a truly native sense of themselves with a capacity for orderly change. English literature grows out of oral tradition, the process of handing down stories from one generation to the next by word of mouth. Every culture possesses an oral tradition to some extent. Families, or groups of families, pass down a record of events to younger generations. The impulse for storytelling, or narrative, is deeply embedded in human beings. Narrative is a method of entertainment, and also a method of preserving truth, particularly in cultures with no written records. What is a good story? For most people, a story is good if they can somehow identify themselves with the characters and events of the narrative. The story appeals to certain basic values of a society, religion, or the history of a clan or tribe, or the fundamental facts of everyday existence for the story's audience. The common experience of an audience, of course, may undergo changes and fragmentation over time. Our notions now of a good story are different from those of the Anglo-Saxons of 15 centuries ago. In modern American society, the stories of the Navajo Indians of the Southwest do not have much in common on the surface with Appalachian folktales or with the narrative of best-selling novels. But all such stories are narratives. They tell something. They exert appeal in their respective cultures because they build on common desires of their audience for entertainment and for a kind of truth. So it was with Beowulf. The first great work of English literature was written down in England in the 8th century A.D. But the story certainly grew out of Anglo-Saxon oral tradition. When the Anglo-Saxons migrated from the shores of northern continental Europe to England, they brought with them their narratives of warfare and the history of their tribes. The Anglo-Saxons were closely related in language, race, and customs to the North Germanic Danes and to other peoples in what is now Scandinavia. All these Germanic peoples shared a social structure of strong warrior groups of men ruled by a king. Their history is one of external warfare, tribe against tribe, and of internal feuds. Warfare's victory and defeat was what mattered most to the Germanic tribes. A good king united the strong warrior bands around him to resist invaders of their land. In victory, the king rewarded his dependents generously with treasure and favors. In return, the king expected to receive honor and loyalty. These truths of social being are important themes in the stories of the Anglo-Saxons. Some of them possessed a primitive form of writing called runic because of the strange signs or runes which were used. But their narrative or storytelling was developed by professional singers or bards who recited poetry that sprang from an oral tradition. The author of Beowulf drew on a number of tales when he composed his story. All of them concern events which took place several centuries earlier in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. The new land of the Anglo-Saxons, England, is never mentioned in Beowulf. The tales of the Anglo-Saxons were tribal relics of the lives of earlier generations, before the Great Migration to England. In Beowulf, the principal story is simple. The great king Hrothgar, who rules the Danes, has united his nobles or earls in a prospering, peaceful society. He builds a magnificent hall named Heorot for his people to gather together and feast. But suddenly, their happiness is destroyed when an evil monster named Grendel overwhelms the warriors in the hall. For 12 years, Grendel preys on the Danes with superhuman strength, and the hall of Heorot is stained with the blood of slain warriors whose flesh the monster devours. But Beowulf, the strong hero prince of a neighboring tribe, the Geats of southern Sweden, arrives to offer help to Hrothgar and the Danes. With his small band of warriors, Beowulf destroys Grendel and also kills the beast's monster mother, who comes to avenge her son. The grateful Danes reward Beowulf, who returns to his own land and inherits the kingdom there. For 50 years, he rules the Geats, until they in turn are menaced by a great dragon. In his last battle, Beowulf is deserted by all his fellow warriors except one man, Wiglaf. He is fatally wounded as he fights the dragon, but manages to kill it with Wiglaf's help. As he dies, the hero orders that the treasure which the dragon had guarded be distributed among the Geats, and names Wiglaf as his successor. The poem closes with the burial of Beowulf. English literature thus begins with a story which is strange and difficult for the modern reader. Beowulf, the central figure, is the poem's most attractive feature. His name means bear, and obviously reflects his remarkable strength. But other qualities are necessary for the good king and for a true hero, as the poem emphasizes: generosity, loyalty, confidence, and trust. Beowulf possesses all these, and is able to use his great physical strength for good ends. He might easily have been a braggart or an oppressor as a king, or even, with a slight change, an evil monster. The poem shows us examples of all these types, and explicitly contrasts them with the hero's unselfish goodness. Beowulf's virtue attracts the sympathy of the poet, who almost certainly was a Christian, even though his song of the Germanic tribes is set in a time before the religious conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. The poem, on one level, is a story of the relentless conflict between good and evil. The author possesses the Christian outlook of the Bible and tells us, for example, that Grendel is descended from Cain, the first murderer who killed his brother Abel. Grendel is no human being, however, but rather a fantastic monster, so terrible that his savage appearance cannot be fully described. If the monster inspires wonder and awe as the very extreme of evil, so in turn does Beowulf, who exhibits his miraculous strength in the service of good. The hero deliberately fights his battles without a sword, relying solely on the strength of his hands. It is certainly the poem's moral intention to focus on extreme examples of the conflict of evil and good. So extreme, in fact, that evil is personified in supernatural monsters, and good must be superhuman to overcome it. This moral perspective, which the poet of Beowulf inherited from his sources, and which he enlarged through his references to the Bible, is optimistic, in the sense that the poem is centered around a great hero who devotes his life to the defeat of evil forces. But the narrative of Beowulf originated in a pagan society, where the facts of life and death on earth were not influenced by the Christian belief in an immortal soul and a spiritual life beyond the grave. Thus, the poem of Beowulf also displays a pessimistic tone, and a grim, earthbound perspective. The poem's structure emphasizes this pessimism. It begins with the funeral of Scyld, the ancestor of King Hrothgar of the Danes, and it ends with the funeral of Beowulf and the raising of his monument by the sea. Despite Beowulf's heroic struggles and his eminent success, he still finds himself deserted by nearly all his comrades in his last battle. Human fear and cowardice lead to the breaking of the code of loyalty and to Beowulf's own death. The hero resigns himself to his fate without bitterness. But the narrative emphasizes throughout how fragile is human survival in a world of violence, betrayal, and hatred. Beowulf's great virtues succeed for a time in fending off evil, but even he is doomed to death. The author of Beowulf makes references to the Christian God, but he has much in common with the pagan outlook of the warriors he describes. He tells us that Beowulf's soul goes to the glory of the righteous when the hero dies. But the poem makes clear that Beowulf lives on principally in fame through the poet himself, the creator of tales, who tells and retells the narrative of his glory on earth. The notion that fame is achieved through courageous deeds on earth, which a poet remembers in song, also underlies the heroic epic poetry of the ancient Greeks. A sustained, comprehensive account in song of the adventures of a hero is called an epic poem. Beowulf, although it is much shorter than Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, amply fulfills the requirements of epic poetry. Epic comes from the Greek meaning word or utterance. Nearly all of the epic songs in world literature celebrate the great deeds of memorable heroes in the utterance of the singer or poet. The heroes, like Beowulf or Achilles in the Iliad or Odysseus in the Odyssey, are models for the culture that listens to the singer's tales, because they embody, in life and death, the basic values of the audience. Why were the stories of heroes remembered in poetic form? The word poet also comes from Greek and means maker. A poet makes a record of a tale for his fellow men. Likewise, the Anglo-Saxons called the oral poet a scop, or creator. In most literatures, poetry is developed earlier than prose, and this is almost always the case when a high premium is placed on the memory of past events. Poetry is simply easier to remember than prose, in spite of the fact that prose means direct speech. Poetry, unlike prose, is related to song, where sound devices like rhythm, meter, and rhyme regularly recur. These sound devices function as aids to human memory, and their pattern almost always makes poetry easier to reproduce than direct speech. In a number of societies which had not yet developed the art of writing, the poets who professionally recorded narrative in song were honored and occupied a special place in the culture, as we can see from mention of such poets in Beowulf, in the Greek Odyssey, and in other early epics. Like the Homeric Greeks, the Anglo-Saxons had developed an oral literature from the tradition of storytelling before their culture adopted writing. And Beowulf, somewhat like the epics of Homer, is composed in a strict system of verse lines. We think of rhyme, or the same sound at the end of successive verses, as the feature that most helps us to remember poetry. But the singers of Old English were aided by a combination of two different devices, rhythm and alliteration. Rhythm is the pattern of stresses or accents in a line of poetry. Alliteration is the repetition of sounds within an individual verse. Every verse of Beowulf, and of all Old English poetry, displays alliteration of a particular sound, and also a regular rhythm of 4 stresses. For example, when the poet describes the wild swamps where the monster Grendel lives, he says, in one translation, "The fell and fen his fastness was." The rhythm combines with the alliteration to produce a strong, memorable effect in Old English poetry. Old English literature also offers us a variety of short poems. Many of these are on religious themes and reflect the religious conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. One of the most beautiful, brief religious poems is again by an anonymous author. It is entitled The Dream of the Rood, or as we should say, The Dream of the Cross, and describes an imaginary dialogue between the narrator and the cross on which Christ died. In another anonymous poem, The Wanderer, a homeless warrior in exile laments his fate and dreams that he encounters his old fellow soldiers who vanish when he awakens. Both The Dream of the Rood and The Wanderer emphasize Christian salvation in the afterlife. Striking as they are, they cannot compare with the narrative power of Beowulf, which combines a moral vision with the thrilling elements of myth and folktale and the excitement of a heroic story. The Anglo-Saxon Beowulf was not translated for the first time into modern English until the early 19th century. By then, its dialect was long forgotten in English, since major changes in the language had occurred. The manuscript, or handwritten copy of the early epic poem, lay untouched for centuries. All speakers of English can now regard it as an historical treasure, a unique record of the beginnings of English language, literature, and culture. However different our modern concerns, the epic treatment in Beowulf of the conflict of good and evil is as powerful today for us as it was over 1,200 years ago, if we, aided by our imagination, are able to enter into the world of this epic hero.